Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli recording a lecture for A&P1 students at Madison Area Technical College, and the topic is Major Themes in Human Anatomy and Physiology. So there are many processes or themes that you will encounter over and over again as you study A&P1 and A&P2. And on this slide, there are some listed, such as metabolism, which is just the sum of all the chemical reactions that take place in your body. That we'll talk about with every organ system. Fluid dynamics, how blood flows, is explained by fluid dynamics. We'll talk about hormones in both courses and with almost every organ system. And of course, electrical forces on the lower right there explain a little bit about how the nervous system works and how muscles contract. So there are other things listed on this slide, many different processes that you'll encounter over and over again. But today I'm just going to talk about 4 themes that recur throughout this course, Anatomy and Physiology 1. These 4 themes are physiological variation, metabolism, homeostasis, and then finally something called negative feedback mechanisms. So first, I'll discuss physiological variation. That just means how does the function differ between people, either between 2 individuals or in one person from one time point to another time point. So how your body functions is based partly on your gender, age, your diet, your weight, your physical activity level, and many other things like genetics. Some examples of physiological variation with which you're probably already familiar include things like heart rate. You know that the heart rate can be different in different individuals, as well as resting versus activity, or with activity. Blood pressure varies from person to person, partly due to differences in age, gender, diet, weight, and physical activity, but also genetics. There's also some examples of variation due to gender. So between males and females, things like red blood cell counts, percent body fat, and body temperature can vary. So it's very important to recognize that variations can occur, because eventually, once you're in a clinical setting, it will be necessary in order to avoid over or under medication, maybe misdiagnoses or mistreatment. So throughout this course and the next course, we use a textbook for human anatomy and physiology written by the author Lane Marab. And in this particular textbook, they often give values for things like red blood cell counts, heart rate, body temperature. And I would like you to be aware of the fact that they use a reference male and a reference female for these numbers. In both cases, they're 22 years old, and then the weight is also known. For males, 155 pounds, and for females, 125 pounds. Now, often you'll see a range, so that might be for adults in general, or average weights as well. But in general, these are the reference body types, if you will, for the different parameters that you'll see in the textbook. So let's go through these 4 major themes. Okay, so besides physiological variation, the second major theme is metabolism. Metabolism is just a term that describes all the chemical reactions that take place in your body. So the sum of all internal chemical reactions, so in all of your cells, in all of your organs throughout the body. Now these chemical reactions could be either anabolic or catabolic, and you have both going on simultaneously in your body. So anabolism, or anabolic reactions, synthesize complex molecules from simpler subunits, so you make something big. Catabolic reactions, or catabolism, you break down something large into simpler subunits. So to do this, our body exchanges energy with the environment. So when our body breaks something down, catabolizes a nutrient, for example, something that you might eat, the chemical reaction releases energy, and that energy is partly given off as heat and also captured to produce a compound called ATP. This ATP molecule can be stored short term to be used to fuel another reaction that might require energy. In the process, you often have waste products as well that we get rid of in our urine or when we exhale. So energy is released when something is broken down, but when we build something up in an anabolic reaction, we need energy. Okay, we actually have to input energy into the chemical reaction. So that's just a brief synopsis of what metabolism is, and we'll talk more about it in the next couple weeks. The third major theme that we'll encounter throughout the course is something called homeostasis. And simply put, homeostasis is the tendency of our bodies to maintain a stable sort of internal condition. But it's important for you to realize that this stable internal condition may fluctuate, and that may be normal. So what we say is stable but dynamic internal conditions. For example, body temperature is something that stays relatively constant. We have homeostatic body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. But it doesn't stay that temperature 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the entire year. It averages 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Although there is an article that was recently published that says that that's a little bit high for average body temperature, and it's really something more like 97 degrees, but we're going to stick with what has been known for years, I guess, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So it fluctuates throughout the day with your activity level. However, if it doesn't go back to this homeostatic level, then homeostasis is imbalanced, or there's an imbalance in homeostasis, and that might indicate a disease or some kind of an altered condition. So that's why we make note of things like body temperature. In order for homeostasis to be maintained, there has to be some sort of mechanism in the body to do that. And what it requires is there has to be a normal set point, such as body temperature range, and there has to be an ability to monitor that condition. So something in the body has to be told that it's normal or abnormal. And then once it's monitored and sensed, there has to be an integration center that tells an organ system what to do or how to change the condition when needed. So that integration center coordinates the activity of many organ systems to keep the set point, to keep the value at the set point. So this often involves what we call negative feedback mechanisms, and I'm going to explain that with body temperature for you. A negative feedback mechanism recognizes when a homeostatic imbalance has occurred. So for example, to maintain body temperature, normal body temperature, we need to sense when body temperature gets too low or it gets too high. So when the core body temperature gets too low, that is sensed. It's actually sensed by the brain, and the brain then also sends a signal out to the muscular system to start shivering. So the muscles contract, and that generates heat and restores optimal body temperature. We call this a negative feedback mechanism because what has happened is, as body temperature has gone down, something has reversed that, and that's the muscular system. So it goes back up. That's why it's called negative feedback. The same thing happens when we become too hot. So you're outside, you're working hard in the yard in the August heat, and your body gets too hot. The brain senses that and tells the sweat glands to cool your body, to make more sweat, and the heat evaporates with the water and your body temperature goes back down. So again, that's a negative feedback mechanism. So the components of a negative feedback mechanism include a set point. That's the level or the range at which the factor has to be maintained. There has to be some sort of a receptor that senses any change from set point. And that receptor has to send the information to an integration center. Now sometimes the receptor and the integration center are one and the same, somewhere in the brain, for example. Other times, like with blood pressure, there might be two different structures. A receptor that detects pressure, that information is then sent to the brain. But nonetheless, the integration center is almost always the brain. Not always, but usually. And it will direct a response. So it sends information out to effectors that carry out a corrective action, like the muscular system or the sweat glands. So with our previous example with body temperature, the set point was 37 degrees Celsius. The receptors are called thermoreceptors, and they sense a change in blood temperature. And the integration center is the brain. The effectors that have the corrective ability are blood vessels, sweat glands, and muscles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how blood vessels, because I haven't yet, how blood flow through blood vessels can actually help control body temperature. Okay, because the blood vessels are so important and come into play as we discuss several organ systems, I think this is really important, and we'll do it with the integumentary system soon. So there are two conditions for a vessel that affect body temperature. One condition is vasodilation and one is vasoconstriction. When a blood vessel dilates, it gets wider. The diameter is bigger. So that's vasodilation, and it's shown in the picture on the left over here. This allows for a greater volume of blood to reach the surface of the skin, and the blood is carrying heat. So heat can evaporate then across the surface of the skin. And the reason that evaporation, or I should say radiation, occurs is because there is a temperature gradient between the blood and the environment across the skin. So the blood is really hot and the environment is colder. So heat will go from high heat to low heat, just like the radiator in your house, if you have one. Vasoconstriction is the opposite conditions. So in this case, it retains heat for the body. And when vessels constrict, their diameter is more narrow, therefore there's less blood flow to the skin. That means heat goes down, right? So you'll have less radiation because the gradient won't be as strong. It'll be more equivalent, right? So you won't have as much heat loss across the skin. That helps control body temperature when we go out to cold environments. So it restricts how much heat our body loses to the cold environment. And to me, it's one of the cruelest tricks of nature, because when I go out in January to unlock the car or whatever, or shovel snow, the blood vessels in my fingers constrict, at least the ones that go to the skin, right? So they're already cold, and then the blood vessels constrict and they feel even colder. They constrict to conserve heat for my internal organs, my vital organs that are more in the core of my body, but the fingers feel so much colder without as much blood pumping to the skin. So it's kind of cruel, but we sacrifice the fingers for the heart, I guess. So there are examples of multiple organ systems interacting to maintain homeostasis. For example, with temperature, we see that the integumentary system, the circulatory system, and the muscular system all work together to maintain our body temperature. Another example is that our body fluids and blood in particular needs to be maintained at a certain pH. That's approximately 7.4. And this is done by two organ systems in particular, the urinary system and the respiratory system, which can both get rid of acid or hydrogen ions. And that is our biggest challenge with pH, is that we produce a lot of acid, either in the form of carbon dioxide or an actual metabolic acid with hydrogen ions. So the urinary system can get rid of that in our urine, and the respiratory system can get rid of it just in the form of CO2, which is good. Now, deviations from homeostasis aren't always a sign of disease. Sometimes it's really important to have a change from homeostasis. But if it occurs in a normal situation without disease, it's always rapid and very short-lived change. So, or at least it should be. For example, fever, right? You don't want fever to go on forever, right? Body temperature needs to be maintained so that all of our cells function normally, particularly proteins. Blood clotting is another example. We want our blood to clot when a wound occurs, but we don't want it to clot all the time and in all locations. The example that I'm going to talk about when a deviation from homeostasis is normal is in uterine contraction during childbirth. So normally, if a woman is pregnant, you want the uterus to expand with the growth of the fetus. But at some point, you're going to need that homeostatic expansion to stop, and instead for the opposite to occur, and that is to constrict or contract the uterus so that childbirth will occur. So how does that happen? We're going to talk about it a little bit. It happens through something called a positive feedback mechanism. So first there's a stimulus that causes a change away from set point. For example, expansion to a certain point of the uterus. But we'll come back to that. That stimulus is going to be sent to an integration center, and the integration center induces an amplifying cycle that causes further deviation from set point. That's why we call it positive feedback. And it repeats over and over again in a loop. So the stimulus causes deviation from homeostasis, which causes more deviation from homeostasis, and it keeps going. Eventually, there's not going to be a stimulus anymore, in all of these cases. So the feedback loop stops as well. So let me show you how it works with childbirth. The stimulus is that the head of, I know I made you think it was contraction, but that's not exactly what it is. The head of the fetus presses against the cervix, and this pressure is not normal right here. That is not normal, right? And there are nerves in the lining that eventually send a signal all the way up to the brain. So this is the integration center. So there was a stimulus and a receptor. That signal is sent to the integration center of the brain. The brain sends out a signal to an effector, and one of the effectors is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland releases a hormone called oxytocin, which really stimulates another effector, which is the uterus. And what oxytocin does is it stimulates the uterus muscle, the muscle in the lining of the uterus, to contract. Now what does that do? That presses on the fetus or the baby, and the baby gets pushed farther down to the cervix. Well, now there's more pressure on the cervix, more than occurred before. So the same thing happens again, and it recurs like this in a loop until eventually, because the cervix opens here, until eventually the fetus is pushed out. And once the fetus is pushed out, there's no more stimulus. So then it stops. So I've written all of those steps on this slide so that you understand the different components. There's a stimulus, there's a receptor, and there's an integration center. Then there's an effector, the pituitary gland first, and then the uterine wall. And what this positive feedback loop is that once the uterus contracts, that is another stimulus, and that's sent to the integration center, and the uterus contracts some more. So those are the major themes that we're going to encounter in different organ systems throughout A&P1 and A&P2. Thank you.